Hello everyone, my name is Cole, and in this video I want to show you how my new advanced side-scroller camera works. Cool, if you add this to your project, you'll see an advanced side-scroller camera folder, and inside that you'll find the blueprints that we're going to use for this. Cool, the first thing we want to do is, let's say you have a project that you are already working on, and you have a camera set up. Usually what happens is you have some camera lag just to smooth out the camera movements, but that means that the player will actually move towards the edge of the screen in the direction that he is moving, which means you will see less of where you are actually going while you're moving. So that isn't always desirable, especially if you have a character that moves fairly quickly. Cool. So the way we add our new camera to the game is we simply drag BP Advanced Side-Scroller Cam into our world. And then in the setup over here, you can click on this little dropper and pick your character, and then click Connect to Player. And that should be it. We can now always delete the old camera if you want. I'm going to do that quickly. So let's delete our camera and delete the spring arm. And now if you press play, we've got our new camera set up. And you'll immediately see that my camera leads the player and looks ahead where he's going, basically, to give you some more view of what you're actually doing and where you're headed. Cool. So let's go through a few of these settings. You can click on the camera itself to get access to your settings. The first thing we want to do is make sure your right direction is set up correctly. That depends on how you set up your game. If your character is moving left to right on the y-axis, it can either be Y minus or Y plus. Let's set this to Y plus quickly. I'll show you. You'll see the camera jumps to the other side. If you play now, if I press right on my keyboard, you see he moves left. So that'll tell me that I am looking in the wrong direction. So let's set that to Y minus. Y minus is the default that you would get when starting from a side-scroller project in the templates. So let's press play. Cool, and now that works. If your game works on the x-axis, you can set this to x plus or x minus depending on what works for you. And that'll automatically change the rotation of the camera and set up the whole system to work with your game correctly. Cool. So let's look through the settings quickly. I made this little preview smaller. You can do that by going into Editor Preferences and searching for Camera. And then we'll see over here, look and feel, camera preview size. I'm going to put that back to 5 just to make it easier to see what we are doing at the moment. Cool. I'm just going to change the perspective or the aspect ratio of the screen quickly, this window, to be more closely resembling 16:9. Oh yes, and another cool thing about the system is usually when you run your game on a super wide monitor or an ultra wide monitor that is wider than 16:9, the default behavior for Unreal Engine is it'll crop the top and the bottom and keep the horizontal field of view the same. So that means if you play on an ultra wide monitor, you'll see less of the top and the bottom of the screen instead of seeing more of the sides. And my system actually works. It measures that a few times a second, and I'll show you how that works. Let's open a new editor window quickly. I'm just going to show you quickly. Cool. Let's set this to basically 16:9 almost. Now if you go ultra wide, you'll see it actually zooms out again. So if you set your resolution, you'll always see the same amount, at least the same amount of detail in your scene. Cool. If you want to set that only when you change the resolution settings or in the beginning of the game, you'll see if we go to your event graph, there's a set FOV depending on the screen's aspect ratio. And you can always call this, let me just delete these old nodes. You can always call this only when your player changes the resolution or when the game starts. Or currently it's set to do it basically 5 times a second to change on the fly. And I've noticed that it doesn't have much of a performance impact. So if you want to leave this as is, it should work perfectly. Cool, so let's go through these settings quickly. Spring arm length is pretty self-explanatory. As you make this longer or shorter, the camera moves closer or further away from the player. Let's say I want to make this a bit closer to give you like a seafood type of camera. Then the next one brings us to height offset. We can change the height offset to center our player back into the frame, or we can set it a bit higher and then use camera pitch to look up and down to frame our player. Let's see how this looks quickly. This is a bit strange, so let's reset the height and the camera pitch. I think I'm going to make it a bit lower actually. A bit lower and look up a tiny little bit, like that. Cool, that feels nice. And as you can see, as you zoom in, the camera leads more and more of the frame. That's because the lead settings works on a measurement value, and I'll show you that just now. Cool. So the next one is focal length, which is the zoom of the camera. So if you want a different type of look, you can make the spring arm longer and then zoom in a bit more. And that'll give you a flatter type of look to your game. So I'm just going to reset those. And then aperture will change the f-stop or the aperture of the camera. And if you make that smaller, you get more of a depth of field effect. Let's make that 0.1. Let's press play. Just going to make this full screen quickly. Now you see the background is kind of blurry. And you can play around with these settings to make it more or less blurry. Cool. Now we get to camera movement. The max lead distance is what I spoke of earlier. If you make that less, let's make it 100 and press play. And you'll see my character isn't being led as far ahead as previously. If you make that more, and you can make that more or less depending on how far your camera is zoomed out. Now we're seeing a lot more in the direction that we're looking. There we go. Cool. And max lead angle, that actually changes the angle of the camera as it looks towards the front of the player, basically. So if you make that more extreme, just to show you, see, it actually turns to show you more of where you're going. And this is fairly extreme now, so I'm just going to set that back to normal. Ooh, and lead speed is the speed at which the camera changes to that lead measurement. So currently it's set to 1, and you see it moves nice and slowly towards showing you more of the front of the screen. If we put that up to 5, which is probably too extreme again, now it almost snaps to the position. So let's set that back. The return speed is how fast it returns back to the player. You can see at the moment it's fairly slow. If I stop, it kind of goes slowly back to the player. If we turn that up to 2 maybe, it should go back fairly quickly. It's much quicker. And if you put that down to something like 0.1, it'll go back very slowly. And then only if we turn around, it'll go back faster again. Cool. I like to leave these at default unless you are playing around with the length of the spring arm and the zoom of the camera and stuff like that. Cool. Then we have track depth. Track depth is only for games like Inside or Little Nightmares, where you can actually, it's a side scroller, but you can actually move towards and away from the camera as well a little bit. So my game is set up to do that currently. So instead of just going left and right, we can go into the screen back and forward a little bit as well. And if we have track depth enabled, the camera will move into the screen or out of the screen with your character as you move towards and away from the screen. And then depth track offset ratio is a kind of cool thing. If you put that up to 0.5, the camera will only move half the amount that the player is moving. So now you'll see the player will move away from the camera. The camera tracks him, but not as quickly as the player moves. Same with moving towards the camera. So it gives us a nice smoother effect, but the camera still moves with the player. And you can go, if you go up to 1, it actually stands still. Cool. And if you go negative, player actually moves faster than the camera actually moves faster than the player. If that is something that you would want to do, I'm just going to set that back to 0. And if you disable track depth, the camera will stay in place as the player moves towards and away from the camera. Cool. Max height lag distance. Let us put our player up. Oops. Oh, that's the thing I can show you. If you accidentally move the camera instead of the player, you can just click connect to player again and it'll snap back to the player. Cool. Let's put our player on top of this little pedestal. And now if you jump off, you'll see the player falls towards the bottom of the screen. It's almost like a bit of a camera lag. And we can set the maximum distance that the camera can move. So if you put that to 500, you'll see the player reaches more of the bottom of the frame. And if you put that to something like 100, it'll just help to smooth out the camera a little bit. And your player will still stay inside the frame. If you go negative values, let's do negative 160 or so. You'll see now the camera goes down quicker than the player falls. And that'll help you to see more of the area where you're going to land. So you can set that depending, change how much you want to do that depending on the type of game. Height lag speed, if you turn that down, it'll take longer to move down. And if you turn that up, it'll move to that position faster. That was, again, was quite extreme. I'm just going to leave these at default just to give me a nice smooth movement on the up and down axis as well. Cool. And that is that for the settings for our camera. Now let's get to the cool stuff. Whoops. Connect to player. There we go. Now, one of the cool things about this system is we can switch to external cameras as well. Let's just go to this little area. I'm going to make my camera move a bit closer to my player. And if this is the type of camera that you want for the main part of your game, it makes it difficult when you get to spots like this because you can't really see where you're jumping to. So a cool thing that we could do is add a custom camera, BP custom camera, add that to the world, and then move that. Let's say we want to make a static camera that shows us this little part like this. Cool. And now we want to switch to this camera. So let's add a switch camera blueprint. And let's make this bigger, so that when the player moves through this, we'll have it switch to that camera. Cool. And now to select our camera, with our switch selected, you can look at new view target. It currently says none. If we select this dropper, we can just pick our camera. And now if we run up to the switch area, it'll switch to the external camera, and we can easily see what we're doing across this little gap. What we can also do is move it further back, and then we have those same settings, like camera settings, focal length. Let's zoom in a bit, which gives us a flatter picture, and that'll help us jump even easier. Cool. I felt that the movement or the blend between the cameras was a bit too quick, so we can set the blend time to something like 3. Let's do 3.5. Now if we play it, here we go. Cool. And if we get to the other side, we wanted to switch to another camera. So let's, with our switch selected, we can just hold down Alt and click and drag to make a copy of that. And then position that over there. And let's drag a new camera into the world. Custom camera. A cool thing we can do if you want to view the camera on the main viewport, we can right click the camera and say Pilot Custom Camera, or we can use the shortcut Control-Shift-P. So let's press Control-Shift-P. Now we're inside the camera and we can make our movements. And I want this to be something like this, a little further away. Remember to eject again. Now we want this camera to move with the player. So let's go grab our player quickly. I'm going to hold down Shift so that the camera moves with the player. So when we are standing on top of this little block, let's select our camera again. That's too far away. I want it to be something like this. Cool. And because we wanted to move, track the movement of the player, and we're going to use left and right. So we're just going to enable that, or else our camera would be static like the previous one. Now we want to set the offsets so that the system knows how far ahead or behind the player the camera needs to be. And we can just click on Set Current Tracking Offsets. There we go. Click on that and it'll populate these settings with the current position relative to the player. So now you'll see if we move the player, whoops, undo, that was the camera again. If we move the player, if we snap to tracking, our camera snaps and shows you how it will follow our player. Cool, let us test that quickly. I was going to set the player over here. Oops, we need to set our switch to our new camera. With the picker, we can click on the camera. There we go. And if ever your cameras are moved around a little bit and you want to know which one is being switched to, you can select your switch volume and then just click on this little magnifying glass and it'll take you to the camera that it's going to switch to. So let's do that. Oop, there we go. Cool. So let's press play. So now we've got a camera that follows us left and right, but doesn't move up and down with the player. And we can also add that same lead movement to the camera for the external cameras as well. As you can see now, it moves ahead to show the player more of where he's going. Okay. Depth track offset ratio, that is the same. If we track the depth, it's tracking up and down, left and right. And again, if we've got a game like Little Nightmares, we can run into the scene as well. It'll track, and it's that same thing. We can make it 0.5 to make it only track half the speed of the player. So now it moves with the player, but the player moves faster than the camera. Cool. I'm going to leave this one as is. Let's go to the next area. Cool. So when we get there, I wanted to switch back to our default camera. Hold down Alt and drag to make a copy. And if we just reset this view target, let's do this down to 2.5. If this is set to none, it'll switch the camera back to your default player camera that we set up in the beginning. So now we've got this one. I think this camera is zoomed in a little bit too much. Let's just zoom out a tiny little bit. That feels better. Cool. Now I've got a trap over here that is triggered when you walk through this volume. And I want to set up the camera to show the player what's coming. So let's move our player towards this little area so we can set up our shot. Let's say I want to be over there. You'll see there's a ball that comes out. And if you hold on right click, you can move with WASD. And then while you're holding down right click, you can scroll up and down with the mouse wheel to make the movement faster or slower. So then you don't have to mess with this little camera speed thing the whole time. Cool. So let's add another camera, custom camera. This camera to, let's press Ctrl-Shift-P to look through our camera. And I want it to be something like this. Cool. And I want it to track only the left and right of the player. It's maybe a little bit to the side like this. So let's say I don't want it to lead, and set the current offsets. There we go. And we can eject. Oh yes, we need to set the switch to change to that camera. So hold down Alt, make a copy, eyedropper, select that camera. Oops, it's into the floor a little bit. Select our switch, select the dropper. Cool, now it's looking a bit too far up. Let's just look through the camera again and adjust that. There we go. Cool. And then right over there, I wanted to switch to a wide shot to show the player this little gap in the floor that's coming. So, add a custom camera again. I'm going to use track left and right. Let's snap to tracking. I think that's good. So I'm not going to have any offsets for the left and right because I want it to look exactly at the camera. So, and let's set switch to that new camera. Let's try that quickly. There we go. Cool. And then over here, I wanted to switch to a wider camera. Let's add another one. Something like that. And I want that track left, right, and up and down. Let's snap to tracking quickly to see how the player will be framed. I'm just going to move that in and up a little bit, like that, and then set the offsets. There we go. Now we can move that back just to remind us what this camera is doing. Cool. Let's test that. Oh, set the switch again to the camera. So if we jump on this one, it won't move up and down. We land over there. Now this camera will move up and down with the player as we jump up on these things. Ooh, and then when we get to the top, I wanted to just change back to the normal camera. Cool. And we leave that to none, and it'll switch back to the normal camera. Let's just make sure that works. Okay, cool. So I just want to set the aperture for all these custom cameras now. I forgot to do that while I was setting them up. So I want to use the same aperture of 0.1 to give us a nice shallow depth of field. As you can see, the background gets a bit blurred. That's probably a little bit too much. Let's go 0.2. Okay, let's make this camera lead the player as well, just so that we can see where the player is going a little bit easier. Let's check that out quickly. There we go, quite like that. Cool. Let's set our player back to the beginning. Hold down Shift to move with the object that we are moving. Down. Let's run through our level quickly to see if that works. There we go. Cool. That works perfectly. And I think that is basically about it. It should give you a nice idea of what you can do with the system. You can do all kinds of crazy angles and set up shots exactly like you want. Cool. Let me know what you think. If there's anything you want me to add to the system, please let me know, and I will add the most popular requests in future updates for free as well. And one last thing, you'll see all the settings that we have, they are commented out to give you a little quick explanation of what the setting actually does. So if you're unsure, just hover over the setting and it'll explain what it's for and what it does and how it works. And as you can see, it should be pretty easy to add this to your own game, even if your game is pretty far ahead in production. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you have an awesome day.